Hello everybody, welcome back to another review, and this time we are talking about Jungle Action, number 6 through 18. Now, I don't have my camera with me, and I apologize for that, although it shouldn't matter too much because I don't actually own these issues. This is something that came out back in 1972 or 1973, somewhere between those years, and I know that there's a reprint of this coming, or by the time this video is released, it might already have come out. So you will be able to get this collected somewhere, and if you have the Black Panther Essentials or maybe the Masterworks, you might have these issues already. But for me, I don't physically own these, and so I had to go online and read them that way. And so being on camera wouldn't really make much of a difference. So even so, sorry about that. So what this is Jungle Action numbers 6 through 18 are a Black Panther story called Panther's Rage. It's written by Don McGregor, and for the most part, I think the artists rotate around. You've got some stuff with Rich Buckler, Jill Kane draw some stuff. I think there might be one other artist. I know Klaus Jansson's listed somewhere, but I think he just inks some of these. So it's more of just Don McGregor's thing. So Black Panther showed up in Fantastic Four 52 to 54, which I've already talked about. And then from there, he's been a pretty regular member of the Avengers. So if you read the Avengers issues that came out between that Fantastic Four story and this ongoing, you should have a good bulk of Black Panther stuff out. And there was some stuff with Black Panther's character that was done there that I haven't read. I've read some scattered issues of his originally joining the Avengers. And I know some of the stuff that happens there just through, looking online and looking up the character's history and such, but I don't have a very solid first-hand experience with those issues, and I'm just trying to go through like Black Panther as a solo entity before I go through any sort of team stuff. So if you've read those issues, you probably have a leg up on what I'm about to say here, but from the few of those issues that I have read, they are worth looking into. Black Panther joined the Avengers in what I'd consider their kind of golden age. I think pretty much everything from Avengers 50 up to like 150 is considered like the gold standard of that book. And then a lot of people love everything that goes up to issue 200, but then issue 200 is pretty historically controversial, but we won't talk about that stuff. So Jungle Action was a book that started in the early 70s, and it actually started with Marvel in the early 70s, but the Jungle Action series itself is something that came out in the 50s. So Jungle Action was basically just a series of like multi-character one-shot jungle stories, and they were originally published under Atlas Comics. And so after Atlas Comics went away, we eventually got Jungle Action integrated into Marvel. And when Marvel started the series, they kind of did the same thing, which is mostly jungle stories with lots of like random characters. There might be some recurring threads here and there, but for the most part, it's kind of just a series of one-shots. And then around the early issues of the revived Jungle Action series, one of the editors at Marvel, Don McGregor, took opposition to the book. He didn't really like the way that it was a series of stories that took place in Africa and a series of stories that dealt with that sort of history and that sort of setting, but almost all of the characters were white. That he didn't like this idea of white appropriation of African ideals and African settings and such. He basically saw it as kind of the Elvis thing of Elvis at the time of his popularity was just doing everything that black musicians were doing, except he was white, and so it became more mainstream. And so Don McGregor had the same sort of thought process with Jungle Action, where like, you're just telling inherently African stories, but you're making the protagonists white because that's the standard mainstream. And he really didn't like that. And so Marvel was like, okay, fine, then why don't you write Jungle Action? And so he did, and he decided to bring in Black Panther. And so initially, the 5th issue of Jungle Action under Marvel is a reprint of an Avengers story, which is a Black Panther-centric thing, but it does take place within a certain continuity of those issues. So it's kind of tough to just read that out of context. And then from issue 6 to 24, which was the last issue of Jungle Action, from issue 6 to 24, Don McGregor was writing Black Panther as the main character of Jungle Action, and it sort of became that character's first ongoing. Now, there's a whole other thing with Jungle Action 19 through 24, and then the Jack Kirby stuff that comes later, which is the whole story. The whole story is called The Panther versus the Klan, and there's a whole thing with that I won't get into here. I will get into that when I review that story. So for now, we're just focusing on 6 through 18, which is titled Panther's Rage. And initially, because Jungle Action was more of like anthology stories that just took place in the jungle, you had anywhere from like, I want to say 5 to 10 pages maybe of material that the issue would cover for any given character. And so you would get like maybe 2 stories in every Jungle Action issue up to a point. And so the first 2 or 3 issues of Panther's Rage are anywhere from like 5 to 10 pages long, maybe a little bit longer here and there. And then after a point, after like about the halfway mark, maybe even sooner than that, it changed and became like a full 22-page comic book. And what we had with Panther's Rage was a series of chapters, or one-shots really, that built an overarching story. So Panther's Rage is the title of a story arc, but every issue within the story is kind of like a snapshot of events happening within this larger framework of an ongoing story. So every issue is self-contained and still builds on and is built on later. And so you can kind of pick up any issue of the Panther's Rage arc and read it and understand it and get a full story, but it reads better altogether. And sadly for me, I was trying to read this all in one day, and I couldn't because I just kept getting interrupted. And so I was trying to space out over maybe just 2 days, but then I kept getting busy, and so it took me the course of like a week to finally get the time to sit down and finish this whole thing. And I wish I didn't do it that way, because from what I understand of the history of this story arc, there are people that consider this Marvel's first graphic novel, because it is a novel. It is a novel told in comic book form with Black Panther. And it feels very wordy in places because it's doing things that novels would otherwise do, which is a bit of a criticism, which is something that's annoying about it, is that you get like these really elaborate scene descriptions, and they just don't need to be there all the time. What we have here is like, we got these third-person narrations that really get us inside the minds of these characters, because there's no thought balloons. There's no moment anywhere where T'Challa is just thinking and you're reading his thoughts. It's more of just through the art and through the scenery, the third-person narration is connecting the two and saying that this is the state of mind, this is the scene, this is where you are, and it feels almost like stage direction. It's really interestingly written, if not a little bit wordy, and if you get rid of some of the more annoying flowery language that he uses to establish scene, because we already have the art for that, then the third-person narration is really good, because it is kind of the bridging of the art and the ongoing character progression through like quick sentences. And it just, you don't need as much description as much as you need the way McGregor is trying to stop and get you into the psychology of things, to kind he's sort of like coaching you along as you're making inferences about a personality or about an action based solely on the way the character is being drawn. And that's really cool. It's really interesting. This story is good. It's kind of an underrated classic, I think. I don't hear anyone talk about this. And I feel like this is sort of quintessential Marvel. This is really, really good counterculture, 70s protest kind of comic book writing. This is, in the same way that the Hulk was a critique of the Cold War and Spider-Man sort of capturing a day in the life sort of feel, and Captain America being criticism of politics, this is, you take all that away and you look at how the actions of history, and specifically American imperialistic history, affect other people, and you look at the mindset of coloniality through Black Panther, and there's this really interesting ongoing thread with this character of, he's come back to Wakanda here, and he's brought his girlfriend, and there are people in Wakanda that don't trust him anymore because he's been too enculturated by the outside. In Wakanda, for example, there is no piano. There are no pianos in Wakanda, which I think is hilarious because one of my favorite lines in Civil War involves a piano. But there are no pianos in Wakanda, and so T'Challa brings back a piano. And so people kind of criticize him for, like, even your taste in the arts have altered because of this outside influence. And it's making this very interesting case for Black Panther being a character that knew his city. He knew Wakanda. He knew the people. He knew the problems. He knew sort of the political state of this country and why it was separate and why it was never conquered. And so Wakanda is like the purest society in the way that it's never been exposed to capitalistic, imperialistic, fascist, mind-altering propaganda. Like, it's kind of the most homegrown, in touch with themselves society you could possibly have. And the downfall of that is their growth is stunted by not having any sort of connectivity, despite the fact that their growth is in the right direction. So they're progressing slower than they ought to, but they're progressing in the right direction. And it's very much kind of like what we do in DC over with Themyscira, Paradise Island and all that. This idea of the Amazons being characters that are separate from the world, and that is their problem, but it is in that separation that they become better people. Where they're able to escape problems. And so, like, there's a different set of problems that get created simply by being isolationist, but there are lots of different solutions created by not being corrupted in any way. And so we got the same thing with Wakanda, and what we have here is T'Challa comes back, and T'Challa's almost forced integration of Western ideas, and particularly Americanized thinking, has made him lose touch with the way the city operates. And so in places, you have the improvements that are being made by the contributions of other people, that the piano is a beautiful instrument, and that it's actually a tragedy that Wakanda didn't have that already, and it's because of communication that we're able to bring something as beautiful as that over to Wakanda. But then the tragedy is in that T'Challa becomes almost toxically masculine, and that's sort of what the Panther's Rage idea is, which is this idea that Black Panther as an entity, that T'Challa as a person, has become angered and has become like overly aggressive in a lot of ways, and he's very much become, slowly, because of his revenge path and his already kind of inner anger at losing his father and being part of America for so long and the Avengers, he's sort of become this survivalist, ask questions later, beat people up first sort of person. And it's in his sort of natural ability for diplomacy that he's able to solve that. And part of what's interesting about that is T'Challa doesn't have to think to be wise. T'Challa doesn't need to take time to gather his thoughts and to be calm and to like build to like beautiful words of wisdom. They just come to him really naturally. There are moments here where he's talking about like the ideas of revolution, and he's talking about the ideas of liberation and such, and he's talking about this idea of everyone hates the way things are being done, but in your need to create a better system, are you not simply adopting the mentality of the people that you despise? And his aides echo that later, but then T'Challa very early on is talking along the same lines, and he's talking very much along the ideology of needing to focus on personal growth, because that's what builds a society, as opposed to forcing societal growth. And that the isolationist mentality of Wakanda is good for them to become more in touch with themselves, that you should discover who you are, and before there's any chance of you being brainwashed into being something else. And there is a balance of outside influence that helps you become who you are, but at the same time you have to be able to grow and recognize the dangers of simply being reactionary, of simply thinking that because you're oppressed, you're automatically in the right based just because you act. That just because you are the person that is being put down, that anything you do to overcome that is overcoming. And he has like a more nuanced idea of what liberation and personal liberation and stuff like that are. And some of his aides echo that and some of them don't. He's got one aide that is very much against what he's become, and very much against this idea of T'Challa being able to run Wakanda despite spending so much time away from it, that it doesn't matter what his intellectual flourishing is, it doesn't matter how much of a natural leader he is. The problem is that you no longer know these people. You no longer know this society. What gives you the right to govern us aside from your power? And in T'Challa constantly trying to argue with him and being right in his words, his actions are counterintuitive to that, because he's always angry and because he's always violent. Like there is a very different... He's got like two very natural modes, the natural mode of action and the natural mode of diplomacy. And because of his involvement in America and in the Avengers, that sort of need to always be active and to always attack first has made his natural tendency to anger much greater, and he's sort of become toxic in that way. But then at the same time, him being so idealistic about what the world can be, that his natural affinity for diplomacy has become so exaggerated that at points he's more about the platitude, and he's not able to understand how that platitude can be enacted into a more concrete, practical way. And so he's being split in two directions ideologically. And he is both aggressive and proactive, and reactionary and intelligent. It's weird. It's a really interesting dissonance in what his characters become. And the way this story reads, it is like a graphic novel, and it is like every issue is the next chapter, the next step in T'Challa's overcoming the sort of doubt he has of himself as a leader, and the influence of people like the Avengers, and his need for more personal growth, and him getting over his father's death. And a lot of that comes back to the villain of this piece, which is Eric Killmonger. Which, by the way, his name is Killmonger. If your name is Killmonger, there is no point where you can be a good guy. And T'Challa even says that. T'Challa even says at some point in the book where he first meets Eric Killmonger, I think the exact line is something like, "By the very nature of your name, I feel like you're not going to be reasonable," and it's kind of hilarious. And T'Challa has those lots of fun, like almost fourth wall breaking moments where he's just like, "Well, this is how comics work, so I'm just rolling with it," and it's kind of fun. And it is more of Don McGregor showing of like his need to change how comics are being told and understood, and that's fun. So Eric Killmonger is a character that's origins get started in the incident that kills T'Chaka, the Claw's attack on the Vibranium Mound. And he had a former name that I can't actually pronounce, and he gets this idea into him, and he, through the Avengers comics, actually becomes someone that T'Challa meets, and T'Challa thinks he's fine, he's an okay guy, but he's really not. And here he's kind of trying to start a coup d'etat to overthrow T'Challa, and what he wants to do essentially is get rid of the coloniality of Wakanda. That he thinks that because of Wakanda's trade ties, because of Ulysses Claw's attack, because of the surplus of vibranium, and because of T'Challa's now connections to the outside world, Wakanda, by being an extension of its leader, has become colonized. That they may never have been conquered, but their ideology, their personhood, their sense of self has been dominated by interaction with colonial forces and imperialistic forces. And so he is kind of the darker side of T'Challa. He is the guy that is more the reactionary, revolutionary. He's the guy that assumes, because he has been oppressed, that any move he makes to overthrow that oppression is the same thing as overcoming, and it's not. And so the conflict between him and T'Challa is very interestingly thematically tied, that T'Challa can't take him out because he is so much like him, and then at a point, it's his ability to impact and infect people that helps him overcome him. And that T'Challa doesn't actually beat Eric Killmonger. It's a little boy that lost his father to an attack by Killmonger that pushes him off a cliff during T'Challa's fight with him that ends him. And the book deals a lot with the effects of revolution and the effects of coloniality, and this idea that your war for rightness can leave devastation in its wake and you cause collateral damage. Your need to make Wakanda great has sort of forced a situation where people have lost the things that they have lived for, and then by extension our need to constantly try and make things better and sort of forcing our own identities onto other people as imperialistically can be a bad thing. That simply being in a hospital can a lot of times be problematic for certain peoples and their identities based on how the hospital treats them, and that's another plot point that they use here in the book. And it's a very nuanced argument for personhood and for identity and for like racial growth and such, particularly post-colonial eras, and particularly with the idea of, because the whole concept of coloniality is a philosophical debate that didn't really get its strength until about this era, that about the 70s, 80s, and 90s is in philosophy when we started talking more about this. And even then, it wasn't as explicit. One of the professors I study under has written a whole paper about the idea of Puerto Rico versus Puerto Rico, and the idea of coloniality being seeping in through creation and language. There's a lot of stuff Angela Davis has done about this, and lots of stuff that Butler has done on this, and a lot of the really interesting ideas about coloniality and about personhood and about race and about imperialistic domination of persons and of countries and such, and particularly the devastation of the African continent because of imperialism. A lot of those ideas are more modern, and this book is really tapping into the zeitgeist of when it was written, and at the same time became ahead of its time. And it's a really interesting read, and I feel like even at the period it was written, it wasn't fully understood because these sorts of debates weren't happening in the same way. From what I understand of this book's history, it was really popular among college students, and I can totally see that. I can totally see this being part of the boom of Marvel counterculture appreciation, and that when you were at that point where you were questioning social norms, that this book would be a thing that helps you break out of some of your more programmed tendencies. It's really interesting, and it's really subtle about the way it's handling some of these issues. And T'Challa is so immediately complex a character, and it really builds on what we did with him in Fantastic Four and some of the Avengers stuff I've read with him, where he's become this person that has an inner anger that he is trying to quell, and he's become this person that relies on his anger for strength, and the book deconstructs him in order to try and realize what that is. Is it the ritual of the Wakandan people that makes him strong? Is it his own independent identity that makes him strong? Is it his father's example, that deontological standard that makes him stronger? And so what we do is we have this middle set of issues where after trying to fight Killmonger and losing, he basically gets lost in the jungle, and he's just fighting his way back and fighting white wolves and snakes and alligators and dinosaurs, and he's really almost Daredevil, born again, kind of broken down, and forced to face himself and to force his animal instinct and to face his humanist growth and such. And it's just a really perfect way to handle the jungle setting, to handle African history, to be an allegory for Cold War imperialistic behavior, to discuss in a nuanced, fascinating, multi-layered way of the ideas of American coloniality. It's really, really good, and I didn't really get it for a while, because the first few issues as I was reading this, I was thinking, this is good, but I've seen better. And by the time you get to the end, and you realize that this is sort of meant to be read as one epic graphic novel, it starts to make so much more sense, and you start to see this not as a comic book, but as a novel, and as like chapters checking in with an exaggeration of reality, where we're anchoring ideology with these characters. And it's exactly what a comic book should be. It's exactly what a story should be. It's exactly what art should be. It's exactly what like active, skilled art specifically should be. And it's really interesting, and it's never in your face about what it's trying to say. It's never trying to convert you into any one ideology over the other. It's got multiple characters with multiple opinions on these same issues, and so no one's validated at the end, and while others are demonized. Everyone's given a moment to shine and to make their case. The villains like Venom are given a point where they're given their backstory, and we see them as representative of the other, and we used some people like Venom to like talk about like the white versus black American dichotomy, and what is it about standards of beauty and such among white class systems that make them susceptible to the same kind of oppressive behavior as minority groups. We talk about Killmonger and this idea of needing revolution, but then we use some of the Wakandans to talk about liberation being independent of revolution. We talk about people like T'Challa's aides that are trying to make cases for isolationism and against isolationism. We have children there as tools to try and examine personal growth and who you look up to and what the nature of the world is and how much of your identity is built in versus how much of it is imposed on you. And when it is imposed on you, is that imposition inherently fascist, or can it be moral? It's extremely dense, and it's extremely interesting, and it's probably going to end up being one of those stories I go back and reread constantly. I think it's I think it's pretty genius. Again, because it's older comics, the third-person narration does kind of get frustrating, because in places it's this really good, nuanced way to connect the art to the momentum of the story, and you're getting like this more melodrama snapshot into a character's psychology. And then in other places it's just telling you what you're seeing, and then in other places still it's exaggerating with adjectives what you are seeing, as opposed to just letting the scene go naturally through the art. And so some of that might just be Don McGregor getting into the writing mindset as opposed to the editorial mindset. But even so, I think this is amazing. I think this is really good comics. I highly recommend checking it out. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, whether you agree or disagree with anything I said. This is getting trade, I think, at the time of this recording. It's not out yet, but it probably has been by the time you guys see it. So let me know what you guys think. I think this is amazing stuff. And thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you next time.